My name is Adam Janke. I'm my title is Extension Wildlife Specialist here at Iowa State University. I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. And I'm working with Dr. Stefanik on this project on profiling wetlands, and really excited to be joining you all tonight for this webinar. So we thank you for taking the time, and Kay's going to introduce herself now.
Helps if I'm unmuted. So I am Dr. Kay Stefanik, Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. Also joining us tonight is the moderator this evening is Dr. Matt Helmers, Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and he is going to be helping out with our question and answer session. Before we get into the webinar, I just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items. Please make sure that your cameras are turned off and you remain muted during the presentation. If you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat box, and you can either put them in the chat to everyone, or you can direct them to Matt Helmers. And we'll get to all of those questions at the very end. Next. So for our webinar today, we're going to be going over 4 main topics. These are going to include distribution of wetlands in Iowa, both past and present, the types of wetlands we find in Iowa based on their location as well as their water source, the various ecosystem services wetlands provide, and last but not least, we will be going over some of the more notable wetlands that we see in Iowa, and we're also going to be introducing a video project that we're going to be completing over the course of the next 12 months.
We're gonna have to figure out this muting part, but okay. To get us started tonight, we wanted to first transport you to this wetland. And one of the things we're gonna do in the webinar tonight is try to transport you around the state and take you to a bunch of different types of wetlands that we find in Iowa and throughout the seasons, and to show you the diversity of the wetlands that we still have in this state, and sort of try to celebrate that diversity and all the important things that they do for us. So we wanted to start off tonight in Wright County on this beautiful wetland. We want you to notice in this picture taken during the summertime, the water. We're going to talk about the water in the wetlands, how the water got there, what it's doing when it's there, and how organisms like microorganisms and large vertebrates, including people, are interacting with it. We're also going to talk about where the water goes after, and how microorganisms in the water can help improve the quality of it, and also the shape and size of the wetland can also help reduce downstream floods. We're going to talk about the plant diversity that you see in this picture, and then hidden amongst these plants is often a bunch of wildlife diversity. And so we're going to try to feature all of this important diversity in wetland types, wetland locations, and wetland form and function as we explore Iowa's wetlands in the webinar tonight. We want to first sort of start with a discussion of where wetlands are found in the state of Iowa. And we want to sort of first acknowledge that a lot of Iowa is pretty wet. In fact, it's sort of the defining characteristic of some parts of Iowa's landscapes. And based on this geographic rendering of county soil surveys that was done by some researchers here at Iowa State, they estimate that about 30% of Iowa's land area has a tendency to pool water. And that's depicted here with these different colors. This tendency to pool water is also pretty variable across soils in the state, and it is associated with major land forming factors, namely glaciation and rivers and streams. The most recently glaciated landscapes, like what we find on the Des Moines Lobe, have the highest densities of wetlands and hydric soils in the state. The oldest landscapes, like what we find in the Paleozoic Plateau of northeastern Iowa, have the lowest wetland densities and less hills. And then finally, the alluvial plains, where there's rivers and frequent connections between those rivers and the adjacent terrestrial environment, we find a lot of wetlands as well. We know that just hydric soils alone don't necessarily capture the extent of wetlands in Iowa, because as you can see from a zoomed in look here on this small couple of sections in Webster County, the hydric soils aren't necessarily apparent on a drive down a gravel road in Webster County because of the extent of hydrologic modifications that we've seen in Iowa's landscapes, related namely to conversion of wetlands for agriculture with drainage ditches and subsurface drainage tile, or also we see this in urban areas like this scene from Black Hawk County in the abundant hydric soils that are underneath what we today recognize as cities. And so when we talk about wetlands, we kind of have to agree on a common definition of what it means to be a wetland. And so what Kay and I are going to do in our presentation today is adopt this common definition from the literature, that a wetland is land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes indicated by poorly drained soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and various kinds of biological activity that are adapted to a wet environment. And so what we often say, in order to have a wetland, you have to have these three things. You have to have water that pools on the surface related to the hydric conditions in the soils. We have to have for a certain period of time, and then it has to promote the growth of plants that are favored for growing in wet conditions. We have pictured here 2 wetlands from the Des Moines lobe that sort of capture some of the variability that we see in those hydrophytic vegetation. On the left, things that look like grasses, probably mostly sedges and rushes, are certainly adapted to wetland conditions. And on the right, we see plants that actually grow in the water itself. And so if we go back to our hydric soils map, we can get rid of a lot of that less permanent stuff that doesn't necessarily promote the growth of hydrophytic or water-loving or water-obligate plants, and see that the distribution of wetland soils that have water that pools long enough in the year to promote hydric plants are restricted, again, primarily to that Des Moines lobe and the alluvial plains, but of course have a widespread distribution in the state. These soils maps estimate about 3.2% of Iowa's land area would have been in these seasonal or more permanent wetland conditions, 1.2 million acres across the state. Now, again, I've mentioned that this isn't necessarily where we find wetlands today because of the extensive modifications that we've observed. And so there's actually an effort that's been done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to map all the remaining or extant wetlands that we do have in Iowa's landscape still. And that's what we can see on this screen. And so if we toggle for a second back and forth between the hydric soils, the places we'd expect wetlands to be, in the extant wetlands where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has mapped them, you can see that extensive drainage has occurred, particularly in the Des Moines lobe, but also across the state, leading to a relatively restricted modern geographic distribution of wetlands. But there's lots of wetland diversity still out there, and that's what we're going to spend our time talking about tonight: what that wetland diversity looks like, how it came to be there, how it functions, and why people benefit from it. If you want to explore all these different types of wetlands that we have here in Iowa, you can visit this resource that I just presented from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service by just a quick Google search for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Wetland Mapper, or you could copy down that URL that's on the screen now. So in that database, we would find that there's a diversity of wetland types across Iowa's landscape. And here's a graphic that we used in a recent publication to try to convey where all of these diverse and important aquatic environments are. And we can stratify these different types of wetland environments into 3 main types based on primarily where they're found on the landscape. So the first place that lots of wetlands are found in Iowa's landscapes are associated with rivers, and we call those riverine wetlands. And here's just a couple of examples, and we'll dig into the geographic locations where they occur along those rivers, and we'll take a look at some pictures next. The next type of wetland that we find is lacustrine, is the technical name, and that just means it's a wetland associated with a lake. And then finally, the most common wetland type that we have in Iowa, and those that people tend to intuitively think of as wetlands, are what we call palustrine wetlands or upland wetlands, disconnected from rivers or disconnected from lakes. What we want to do now is take you across the state on a quick tour of some of these riverine, lacustrine, and palustrine wetlands that we find in the state with just a couple of pictures. And so we'll start with one of my favorite places in central Iowa, the High Trestle Trail. This picture was taken from the middle of the High Trestle Trail, and I was looking out across the Des Moines River Valley. Now, of course, this is a pretty modified landscape because the influence of the Saylorville Reservoir downstream. But what this picture does a nice job of capturing is the shape and form of a floodplain that's evolved, of course, over, in this case, thousands of years, and in some portions of Iowa's landscapes, hundreds of thousands of years, carving out the adjacent land and creating conditions that are favorable for wetlands when the river floods up and connects with the floodplain. We can transport across the state now and go to Scott County on the Mississippi River and find, of course, that floodplains are still really important over there, where we find lots of bottomland hardwood forests that are adjacent to the Mississippi River, and during certain times of year, like this spring snowmelt, flood up and provide really important wetland habitat. Jump now to the exact opposite end of the state, Fremont County, along the Nishnabotna River, and this is Riverton Wildlife Management Area, an important wetland ecosystem in southwestern Iowa. And this drone picture shows us the really flat nature of this landscape. And so this water would be really shallow across here, and historically would have flooded up out of the Nishnabotna River and created a diversity of wetland habitats. Today, this is mostly controlled artificially because of the extensive modifications to the Nishnabotna and many other rivers through channelization and dredging. Another type of riverine wetland that we find around the state are what we call oxbows. These come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, but these are just disconnected meanders of rivers and streams. In this case, this was just a small disconnected meander from a stream in Hamilton County that create important wetland habitats. Now, glaciers create a lot of wetlands, rivers create a lot of wetlands, but beavers do their fair share as well. Beavers, of course, have a statewide distribution in Iowa, and they, of course, create many different types of wetland ecosystems, mostly associated with rivers and streams. The next type of wetland that I mentioned is these lacustrine wetlands. So this is basically any place where there's hydrophytic vegetation on the margins or in what we would recognize as a lake. Basically, all of the natural lakes that we find in Iowa are lacustrine wetlands. There's a few exceptions with large oxbows along the major rivers, but most of the natural lakes in Iowa are just big wetlands, essentially. Like this wetland in Dickinson County, this lake is called West Hotz Lake, and you can see all that wetland vegetation out in it that makes it a wetland. Another really common type of wetland in the Des Moines lobe are upland depressions, and namely prairie potholes. These are places that glaciers created based on their retreat and their the time that's elapsed since the glaciers have left. And these have the highest densities in that Des Moines lobe landscape where they're most common. We do find them in other landforms as well, and oftentimes to the east of Iowa, and then also on other landforms. We think of these upland depressions often as vernal pools is another common name. Vernal, of course, just meaning short-lived. And pools, of course, just referring to their sort of shallow nature, and we often find them in forests, and they're really important ecosystems for many different species of wildlife and all the hydrologic functions that we'll discuss. Another wetland type that we're going to explore a little bit more in more detail in a few seconds is called a fen. Now, this wetland looks an awful lot like a prairie to the untrained eye, but if you were walking in this, like Kay and I were last spring when I took this picture in Franklin County, you would find that it was very spongy and there was water pooled right at the surface. And these fen ecosystems are places where groundwater is really shallow and at the surface, often adjacent to hillsides and rivers and streams. Another type of wetland that we'll just call constructed wetland as sort of a catch-all, and we'll talk more about these as the presentation goes on tonight. Just like beavers, glaciers, and rivers build lots of wetlands, people build lots of wetlands too. And in this case, this constructed wetland in Wright County was constructed to intercept drain tile from adjacent farm fields and allow for conditions that reduce the nitrates in the surface water before they head to the Gulf of Mexico and our major river systems. And then, of course, wetlands play a really important role in urban environments as well. And so this Polk County wetland will be our last wetland on our tour of wetlands across the state for now. This wetland both reduces flood risk, it reduces the impact of storm surges in urban areas, and can also, provide for opportunities for outdoor recreation and clean water in urban areas. So many constructed wetlands in those landscapes as well.
All right, so in addition to thinking about wetlands in terms of their location in the landscape, it can also be really important to think about wetlands in terms of their hydrology. And by hydrology, I mean how the water moves within these systems. specifically where the water comes from, where the water goes, how long the water stays in the system, and how long during the year you might have standing water or saturated soils. So when we think about where water comes from, there are three main sources of water to wetlands: precipitation, surface inflow, and groundwater inflow. And then there are three main exports of waters from wetland: groundwater outflow, surface outflow, and evapotranspiration, which is water loss either through evaporation directly from the wetland surface or water loss through plants through transpiration. Now, it's important to note that not all wetlands receive water from kind of a combination of sources. While there are some wetlands that receive water inputs from a mix of precipitation, surface inflow, and groundwater, there are some wetland types that have primarily one main source of water. So if you think of groundwater, wetlands that are predominantly groundwater fed are things like fens and seeps. Wetlands that are predominantly surface flow fed are things like riverine wetlands and fringe lacustrine wetlands. And then wetlands that are predominantly precipitation fed include things like bogs and pokasins. And I want to quickly mention that not all of the wetland types in this triangle are found in Iowa, and not all of the Iowa wetlands are found on this triangle. But I'm going to quickly go through three different types of wetlands that we see in Iowa. The first are fens. So fens primarily get their water from groundwater. Because the water is coming up from kind of below the soil surface, you may not actually see standing water throughout the year or throughout portions of the year in these systems. But because there is that groundwater input, so water coming up from underneath, these areas typically have saturated soils for much of the growing season, so for much of the year. Then next wetland is also a palustrine wetland, a prairie pothole wetland. Prairie pothole wetlands are primarily found in the Des Moines lobe, and they were created during the last glaciation event. So because of this, they are depressions in the landscape. And depending on the prairie pothole wetland, they may be getting their water from a mix of these three different sources, a mix of precipitation, surface flow, and groundwater flow. Because they are lower elevation in the landscape, surface water will flow towards them and groundwater will flow towards them as well. Next. And then for our third wetland type, we have riverine wetlands. So riverine wetlands get the majority of their water from surface flows. So think of these along a river system. Whenever you have a large storm event, especially something that causes the river to overflow its banks and flood into the riverine wetland, you're primarily going to see water in those riverine wetlands during large storm events or during wetter part of the year. Now, in addition to the source of water being important, things like hydrologic residence time and hydro period are also really important for both the structure and the function of these wetlands. Now, hydrologic residence time is the average time required for a molecule of water to pass through a wetland. And this is usually a matter of days in Iowa wetlands. And then you also have hydro period. Hydro period is the period of time during a year that an area has standing water or waterlogged soils. Now, water source, hydrologic residence time, and hydro period all play into the wetlands hydrology. And the hydrology can have direct effects on the biota as well as the physiochemical environment, with the biota being the vegetation, the animals, microorganisms, and the physiochemical environment being the soils in the wetland, as well as the chemistry occurring in the soils of the wetland. Now, hydro periods can vary greatly based on both wetland type as well as precipitation conditions during a given year. So here I have 5 examples of hydro periods for marsh, a vernal pool, a prairie pothole, a fen, and a bottomland hardwood forest. Now on these graphs, the x-axis represents time in months from January to December. The solid black line represents the relative depth of water in the wetland. And then the dashed line, which will show up in red, represents the wetland ground surface. Now, whenever you see the black line above the red dashed line for a wetland, that means that there's standing water in the system. However, at some point, we're going to see the solid line being below one of those dashed lines. And that just means that there's saturated soils in the system instead of standing water. So with marsh systems, it may not be uncommon to see standing water in these systems throughout the entire year. However, you might see variation in depths of water over the course of the year, with deeper water in the wetter spring months. Next type of wetland is the vernal pool. These wetlands tend to dry up during a portion of the year. So you can see that they have standing water in winter as well as the beginning of spring. But once you get into the summer months as well as fall, these wetlands completely dry out. And with prairie pothole wetlands, these wetlands can be heavily dependent on the precipitation in a given year. So during a wet year, a prairie pothole wetland may have standing water throughout the entire year, whereas with a dry year, you may only see standing water during the winter and spring months. And with the fen, you can see that the solid line is below the dashed line. This means in this particular fen, there wasn't standing water at any point during the year. Instead, there was just constant saturated conditions within the soil. And then finally, in the bottomland hardwood forest, which is a riparian type of wetland, you only really see standing water during wet springs as well as large storm events. I want to note that just because you don't see water in a wetland doesn't mean it's not a wetland. So as long as you have either standing water or saturated soils long enough throughout the year to promote the formation of hydric soils and promote the growth of hydrophytic vegetation, then you have a wetland. There are some wetlands like prairie pothole wetlands and vernal pools that just go dry during the year. That's part of their natural cycle. And then some other wetlands may only go dry during particularly low precipitation years. These drawdown events or dry events can be really important for things like seed germination and plant growth, as well as for chemical cycling within the soil. Now, so far, we've gone over kind of the where and what of wetlands, but now we're going to switch over to what wetlands do. So wetlands are important ecosystems because of the ecosystem services that they provide. Now, ecosystem services are the essential direct and indirect benefits that nature provides to humans. Wetlands provide things like flood prevention and flood reduction. They help to improve water quality. They can protect diversity, create recreational opportunities, and foster cultural uses. We're going to spend a little bit of time going over each of these ecosystem services, starting with floodwater retention. So when I say floodwater retention, this is wetlands helping to hold stormwater on the landscape for an extended period of time. Now, if you look at floodplain under normal conditions, you're likely to have a river flowing through it and then some wetlands that may be connected or disconnected from that main channel. Some of those wetlands may even be dry under normal conditions. However, when we have a flood event, so with flood conditions, the water in the river rises and it can spill over its banks, filling up some of those nearby wetlands. You can also have disconnected wetlands acting as places to hold both precipitation and surface water runoff from the surrounding landscape in place. So those kind of isolated wetlands can hold that extra water in place and prevent it from directly flowing to the river channel and then being directed downstream. Now, in areas or floodplains where you have wetlands that are intact, these wetlands can act to hold flood water on the landscape for an extended period of time. But if you end up with a system where your wetlands are drained and destroyed, you're losing some of that floodwater storage capacity. So instead of water being stored on the landscape, when precipitation hits the surface, it can quickly run off towards the river or surface flow, end up in the river channel and quickly be transported downstream, where it could potentially end up flooding residential areas. Our next ecosystem service is water quality improvement. So with wetlands, we typically see slow flowing water or long hydrologic residence time. So taking a couple of days for water to move through a wetland. This slow flow allows particles, things like sediment and phosphorus that's suspended in the water column, to settle out of the water column and onto the substrate of the wetland, where it essentially becomes trapped in the wetland, making that water cleaner. You also have compounds that are dissolved within the water, things like nitrate. These dissolved compounds can interact with the soil in these wetlands. Now, one thing that wetlands are really good at is nitrate reduction. So if you have nitrate coming in with your water, so in this case, those pink circles, those nitrate molecules can end up in the substrate, the soil of the wetland, where they can be taken up by denitrifying bacteria. These denitrifying bacteria convert nitrate to nitrogen gas. This nitrogen gas is then released to the atmosphere, effectively reducing the amount of nitrate that's in the water that could potentially be lost from the wetland. Now, throughout Iowa, we're actually using this nitrate reduction potential to our benefit. So we are, and we have been, creating wetlands throughout Iowa to help us reduce nitrate loads coming off of agricultural lands. So if you think of row crop acres, especially in areas like the Des Moines Lobe, there's typically tile drainage underneath the row crop acres. So this tile drainage kind of quickly sends that subsurface water out through a pipe and usually into a stream or other surface body of water. But with a nutrient reduction wetland, we divert that tile drainage water into a wetland ecosystem where that water will stay in there for a few days, the nitrate can be removed, and then eventually that water will make its way to a river or stream and then flow downstream. Wetlands created for nutrient reduction are a practice listed in the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And in appropriately placed conditions, wetlands have shown to reduce nitrate by about 50% on average. And some of the types of nutrient reduction wetlands we see in Iowa are creek wetlands found in the Des Moines Lobe, as well as multi-purpose oxbows, which are found in riverine settings.
So another type of ecosystem service that we find in wetland ecosystems is just their capacity to support biological diversity, which of course is important for lots of other things in society and in the environment. And so the same factors that Kay just described that lead to variation in hydro period in wetlands, or where the water level is relative to groundwater or surface water versus groundwater inputs, and all of those other factors all lead to a bunch of diversity in organisms adapted to all the different types of environments that those conditions create. One place we see a huge amount of diversity in wetland ecosystems is in plant diversity. So because of all the variation in water depths and water permanence and soil conditions and the chemistry of wetlands and other factors, we just see a lot of different types of plants taking advantage of all those different types of niches. In total, there's been a bunch of botanists that have spent a lot of time in Iowa's wetlands, and they've documented 465 different species of plants to occur in Iowa wetland ecosystems. One of these types of wetland plants that occur in Iowa wetlands is this beautiful flower called white turtlehead. And anytime we have lots of plant diversity, we almost invariably find lots of wildlife diversity that have figured out unique ways to exploit the plant diversity or individual types of plants. And that's certainly the case with this beautiful butterfly called the Baltimore checker spot. So the white turtlehead plant grows in fen wetlands, mostly in northeastern Iowa. And favors the environmental conditions that we find in Fens and only grows there. And then the Baltimore checker spot has evolved a life history. That means its larval phase, its caterpillar, is entirely dependent on feeding on the white turtlehead flower or white turtlehead plant. And so that means Fens, where white turtleheads grow, is the only place where we can find Baltimore checker spots, this beautiful species of greatest conservation need butterfly found in those Fen ecosystems. Lots of other types of organisms have evolved to take advantage of all the diversity of conditions in wetland environments. And I think there's no better way to demonstrate all of this diverse adaptations that birds have than to look at a group of birds that we call shorebirds. Shorebirds, so named for their affinity for the shoreline, have a lot of physiological, morphological adaptations to take advantage of variable water depths and variable conditions found in wetlands. Over 30 different species of shorebirds can be found in Iowa at any given time. And here I'm just showing you a cross section of different types of shorebirds. And I'll draw your eye to the variation in the shape and length of the bill, and also to variation in the length of their legs. And each of these adaptations are related to the variable conditions that we find in wetlands and, to a lesser extent, rivers and other aquatic ecosystems in the state. So here's just 34 of them. Those beautiful birds in the background there that I have are called Pectoral Sandpipers. And Pectoral Sandpipers are a relatively common migrating bird in Iowa. And they're only a migrating bird because they just use Iowa as their refueling stations in their annual transition between their breeding ranges inside the Arctic Circle and their wintering ranges in the Southern Hemisphere, mostly in Central South America, but also in Australia, New Zealand, and some other areas in the Southern Hemisphere. These Pectoral Sandpipers concentrate in what we call an hourglass formation, where they spread out at high latitudes, spread out at low latitudes, and like to concentrate during their migration on certain types of ecosystems. And one of the favorite ecosystems of the Pectoral Sandpiper are actually wetlands that we call today farmed wetlands, those upland depressions, prairie potholes that have been modified by primarily tile drainage and other landscape modifications, and only have water during a short period of the year when they're flooding. Pectoral sandpipers are often seen in these areas. In a recent study in these wetlands found that they were the 6th most abundant species of birds found in farmed wetlands in north central Iowa, among 50 other species of birds found using those wetlands. I could go on for days about birds and wetlands, but I'll spare you. But I want to share with you one more. This is the trumpeter swan. I bet this is a bird that many of you are familiar with, because this is a real conservation success story in Iowa. This species was not found at all in Iowa in the mid-1900s because it had been extirpated because of unsustainable exploitation during the Industrial Revolution and the loss of wetland ecosystems. Through the restoration of many wetland ecosystems and an intentional reintroduction project, trumpeter swans today are found in many places throughout the state, and researchers at Iowa DNR and Iowa State University are tying those little GPS tracking devices around the necks of some of these trumpeter swans to see exactly what kind of wetlands they like. Here you can go to this website called Track a Trumpeter. A quick Google search for Iowa State and Track a Trumpeter will turn this up. And you can take a look at a couple of the maps that those GPS collars created for trumpeter swans. Here's one map from Boone County of trumpeter swans sporting one of those little GPS collars, taking advantage of 2 constructed wetlands, those wetlands designed to treat water quality or nitrates in drain tile. You can see the trumpeter swans took advantage of that. And here's another picture of a trumpeter swan taking advantage of a wetland and prairie pothole wetland in Kossuth County on Maynard Reese Wildlife Area. Trumpeter swans, shorebirds, and others are certainly not alone among the species of wildlife that we're interested in conserving that are reliant on wetland ecosystems. In fact, the State Wildlife Action Plan, which is that picture there on the right, identifies hundreds of species in need of conservation in the state of Iowa, and it identifies 120 of those species specifically that are wetland dependent and in need of conservation. So trumpeter swan and many of those shorebirds that I just shared with you are on that list. I wanted to introduce a few others that are pretty uniquely wetland adapted and sort of remarkable from those other taxonomic groups. Here first, an amphibian, all amphibians basically are reliant on wetland ecosystems. And here's the tiger salamander, Iowa's most abundant salamander, has a fully aquatic life phase when it's young. That's what's pictured there on the left. And a mostly terrestrial life phase when it's grown. That's what's pictured there on the right, where they spend most of their time adjacent to wetlands or underneath the ground. Another type of a reptile that's a species of greatest conservation need and entirely wetland dependent is this beautiful turtle called the Blanding's turtle. This turtle is unique among turtles because most of them are reliant on rivers and streams, but the Blanding turtle is specialized to wetlands, and you can see it's quite remarkable with its beautiful yellow underside and spotted shell. Finally, I wanted to mention one fish. Some wetland ecosystems have a few fish. For the most part, fish stay out of wetland ecosystems, but the Topeka shiner is a federally endangered species of fish found in Prairie streams in north central Iowa, and they're really reliant on oxbow wetlands to complete portions of their life history, where they can get out of the main channel of a river or stream and spend time in these oxbows adjacent to rivers and streams to complete portions of their life history before getting back to the stream during the winter months. The next ecosystem service that we wanted to mention is that people derive lots of direct benefits related just to wetland associated recreation in wetlands around Iowa. And so here's one picture from the Des Moines Register of wetland associated recreation at Sweet Marsh in Bremer County in northeastern Iowa. Lots of people all across the state take advantage of the flat, cool waters of wetland ecosystems to explore on their kayaks or their canoes. Also, many people enjoy just observing all that bird life, myself among them, in wetland ecosystems, and we can go to these wetland ecosystems and engage in bird watching. Here's a picture of the Iowa Young Birders group taking advantage of some wetland ecosystems on Chautauqua Bottoms wildlife area in Polk and Story counties. Another really popular wildlife associated or wetland associated recreation is hunting. And to make that point, of course, there's lots of different places that people use wetlands to go hunting in Iowa. There's lots of avid duck hunters in Iowa. In fact, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources annually sells about 27,000 duck stamps to duck hunters to pursue ducks, mostly on wetland ecosystems. One really cool example of this is in Wright County along the shores of Big Wall Lake, a public wetland. A whole city essentially has popped up where duck hunters come and spend their weekends and walk across the street onto the public area and take their boats out there to hunt and enjoy the wetlands. The last ecosystem service that we wanted to mention was to acknowledge the important cultural relationships that many people still in Iowa today, or for as long as people have been living alongside wetlands in Iowa, hold between wetlands and cultural traditions. And so here's a picture from 1925 in Tama County. And what I wanted of the member of the Meskwaki tribe. And what I wanted to point out was that this structure in the background is called a wickiup, and those are often paneled with mats of cattail from wetland ecosystems. And we know that close connections between wetland ecosystems and many different native cultures that were the original stewards of Iowa's lands and waters were important in many of those communities. Another way that we know that the wetland ecosystems were important for many native communities is from this historic map from the early 1800s. This map was drawn by Iowa people at a time where there were disputes about treaty rights and land authority. And this is known as the No-Heart map. And what these Iowa people were communicating was their deep connections and familiarity with Iowa, what today we know as Iowa, with these landscapes and the waterways found there. And so some people have recreated this map and put these rivers and lakes and villages on the map. And one thing that's interesting in Iowa is that wetland ecosystems were clearly important enough to make it onto this map, because if you compare the two maps on the left and the right, you can see that I've recreated a few of the rivers that were depicted on the No Heart map. And then in north central Iowa, the lake that we today know as Storm Lake was included as a culturally important part of these lands that the Iowa people were familiar with and stewarding at that time. And here's what that Storm Lake looks like today. And as I mentioned, most natural lakes in Iowa are just big wetlands, and that's certainly the case of Storm Lake.
All right, so Adam and I have gone over a lot of different types of wetlands. These wetlands vary in size from very small, like Prairie Pothole wetlands, all the way up to larger lacustrine wetland systems. I want to mention 3 of our kind of notable Iowa wetlands. These are notable wetlands due to the overall size of the wetlands. All 3 of these are wetland complexes. So it means that they're made up of a number of smaller individual wetlands. And in some cases, there are even multiple types of wetlands in these areas. So the first notable wetland area is the Okoboji and Spirit Lake area, located in the northwestern part of the state near the Iowa-Minnesota border. You can see that along the southeast, along the southeast portion of the lakes, there are a number of prairie pothole wetlands, like those found near Prairie Lake. And then also to the north of West Okoboji Lake, like those found on Welsh Lake Wildlife Management Area. In addition to these smaller prairie pothole style wetlands, there's also fringe lacustrine habitat in some areas around West Okoboji, East Okoboji, and Big Spirit Lakes. Now, these areas are all important for wildlife habitat, for migratory birds, for fish, amphibians, and other wildlife in the area. They also can act as important places for floodwater storage and can help remove nutrients from the water coming in. Now, in Iowa, we also have some U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Wildlife Refuges scattered throughout the state, indicated by blue. So one of these is Union Slough in the northern part of Iowa, located in the Des Moines Lobe. The wetlands at Union Slough are predominantly kind of prairie pothole, emergent marsh type wetlands. Now, these wetlands were kind of managed and conserved specifically for things like fish, wildlife, and plant resources. Union Slough is made up of multiple wetlands that serve as important habitat, as well as breeding habitat for various birds and migratory birds. And then in the southeastern corner of the state, we have Port Louisa. Port Louisa is directly along the Mississippi River. It contains not only multiple wetlands, but multiple types of wetland habitat. So you can see there's some emergent marsh habitat. This is probably managed for water levels for things like wildlife. And then there's also bottomland hardwood forest or riverine habitat right along the Mississippi River. So not only are these wetlands helping to provide habitat for fish, amphibians, and birds, but they also can have important floodwater and nutrient reduction potential, especially for those bottomland hardwood forests right along the Mississippi River. When the Mississippi River floods over into these areas, it can help to hold stormwater and it can help to remove nitrates in that water. Now, these are some of our larger, more notable wetlands in the state, but you're probably aware that there are many, many more smaller wetlands found throughout Iowa. All of these wetlands provide valuable ecosystem services and have a valuable place in Iowa's landscape. So to further highlight the importance of different types of wetlands in Iowa, we are going to be creating a wetland video series that promotes the ecosystem services, things like water quality improvement, and wildlife habitat benefits of wetlands found throughout the state. This series is going to include 12 videos, one released each month from June through May 2022. Each video will highlight a specific wetland type and will go into information on the wetland's location, its history, its hydrology, characteristic vegetation and wildlife, and various ecosystem services. We're going to try to include wetlands that are natural, restored, and created, as well as wetlands that can be found on both privately owned and publicly owned land. For these videos, we are going to be getting a drone, so hopefully we'll have some good aerial footage of these different wetlands, a perspective that you may not see if you're just out and about walking in these areas. This project is funded by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Diversity Program.
So in concluding our presentation tonight, we want to thank you for your time, for joining us to learn about and celebrate the diversity of wetlands that we have in the state. We see lots of questions coming in the chat. We're really excited to have some discussion on that. And we wanted to take you to one last wetland. Frankly, I just really wanted to get this picture in here. This is a beautiful riverine wetland adjacent to a small stream in Washington County, Iowa. These are river birch trees, a relatively rare wetland adapted tree found in more commonly in southern parts of the US and found here in southeastern Iowa. Just like that wetland we started with in Wright County at the beginning of the talk, this wetland is providing important habitat for wildlife. It's holding back floodwaters. It's filtering water. It's creating conditions favorable for the growth of a diversity of wetland adapted plants, including those river birches, and then creating places for recreation or other cultural services that wetlands provide. So we hope that this gets you thinking about where you find wetlands in your neck of the woods, and we're really looking forward to having more discussion here in the question and answer session. So thanks for joining us. And we're going to ask Matt, I think you're going to help us parse through some of these questions. Yep. We also pulled our emails up there, so if you have other questions, you could follow up with Kay or I afterwards.
All right. The first question is, when a wetland determination is performed by the FSA office, do they use that same definition that you started out with?
Okay, so I'll take a stab at that. I was looking at UK. We'll just have to go back and forth on answering questions. We are not always the best policy people. We ivory tower academics. So I'll just lead with that. We tend to think about processes and less about policy because that's what we focus on. My understanding, though, is that, yes, those three things are the common definition, the legal definition used in wetland determinations: the presence of or evidence of hydrophytic vegetation, water that pools for a certain period of time, and hydric soils. Is that how you would answer that, Kay?
Yes.
Yeah, I think NRCS or FSA might give some definition on time, like 12 days or certain days, but I think in general that's right.
Great,
okay, this is a kind of an interesting one, and I have to say that now every time I drive throughout Iowa, I think about places where there's potential oxbows. I saw some great potential driving up to the Iowa Great Lakes this weekend. So does farming and agriculture contribute to oxbow formation, or is it more a normal ecological occurrence?
I'd say oxbows are more of a normal ecological occurrence. In areas where there's a lot of agriculture, there's actually been a lot of sedimenting in of oxbow wetlands. So in order to get these like multi-purpose oxbows that help to reduce nitrate levels, people are actually having to go out and dig up the sediment that's filled in those oxbows to return them to functioning wetland ecosystems.
I have to say, a lot of them that I've noticed where there's potential for an oxbow is kind of in a pasture area, and you can really make out where that kind of landscape is of the old oxbow.
Oh, yeah, okay. I saw a good comment. Somebody mentioned that oxbows are formed due to channelization. So yeah, oxbows form when part of a stream channel gets cut off from the main river system.
Okay, let me get back to where I was here. Have riverine wetlands changed over time due to reduced groundwater flow, drainage, drought, and other changes?
Yes, almost no wetland is unimpacted in Iowa's landscape because of the extent of hydrologic modifications that have occurred. So channelization is a really good example of that, and one that really affects riverine wetlands. And so channelization is where the channel is straightened, often narrowed and deepened, basically to make the river or stream a water conveyance mechanism to get the water out of here. That has impacts on adjacent groundwater, and that impacts wetland conditions. It also impacts the ability for the river or stream to connect to the floodplain and create wetland conditions. And then the last idea that I have in terms of the impacts of agriculture on riverine wetlands in that way, or impacts of those modifications, is through sediment deposition. We've seen this period of what I think they call, is it aggradation, where there's just sediment that builds up on the banks because of all the erosion higher in the watershed, and it makes it harder and harder for rivers and streams to actually connect with the floodplain. And so it becomes harder to have wetlands adjacent to rivers and streams, just because the goalposts have moved, so to speak, and for the ability for the river or stream to actually connect with the floodplain. So lots of impacts for sure.
Yeah, and that loss of connection between the river system and wetlands can result in some pretty significant downstream flooding during large storm events.
Okay. This person asked about a fen. If there's somebody, they ask who can identify whether you have a fen or something else. Who should they ask? Any resources out there that either of you can think of?
Yeah, I saw that question, and that's a great question. And it's great to be thinking that way, because sometimes people don't notice, especially such a subtle landscape element. What I would recommend would be talking to a soil scientist with the NRCS, or a wildlife biologist with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Both of these people often have a pretty good idea. If you live in northeastern Iowa, you should especially be interested in this, because that's where we see our highest density of fen wetlands in the state, like the northeastern quarter of the state.
There was one slide that had Anna branch on it. What is that just about, was specific to that slide, or was that, is there something, I guess the question was definition of an Anna branch.
So an Anna branch, that is something that you find within a floodplain. It's, you can think of it as a secondary channel to the river. It may receive water inputs kind of on a regular basis, but sometimes you only have water inputs into it during flood events.
Do you see shifts in above versus below ground biomass in wetlands with high nutrient input?
Ooh, I'm not too sure about that.
Okay.
I saw that question. I wasn't entirely sure what biomass, like sometimes we talk about above and below ground in terms of like root systems. I was
wondering if submergent or emergent vegetation, whether anybody's looked at how the nutrients might input or impact submergent or emergent vegetation maybe.
So I feel like submergent and emergent vegetation, that has a lot more to do with water depth. But when you have a system where the water depth is good for submerged aquatic vegetation, having excess nutrients can lead to kind of an overgrowth of those submerged aquatic plants. And you may also see an overgrowth of algae floating in the water column or on the water surface as well.
Okay. So, this one, go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to mention, Kay, I noticed that Sarah, the person that asked that question, clarified root system versus green emergent. Okay. I can't say I know anything about below ground goings on of wetland ecosystems, so I really appreciate the question. I'm curious, Kay, if you know the answer.
Part of my PhD work was looking at above and below ground biomass, but I didn't specifically look at it for nutrient inputs. So I'm not sure about how nitrogen might affect that. I would mention though that in nutrient-rich systems, you typically have a shift from kind of mixed height emergent vegetation to taller vegetation like cattails. When you get those taller plants like cattails, you also tend to have larger root systems associated with that. So just the shift in plant species to taller, larger plants may lead to an increase in the below ground root biomass in the system.
Okay. And that really kind of relates to the next question, whether those high nutrient levels might favor certain species. And it sounds like they can maybe move toward more of some of those cattail taller vegetation.
Yes, and in certain systems, such as a fen, if you were to have large nutrient inputs into a fen, you could actually start shifting some of that vegetation away from that really diverse fen community and bringing in some of those cattails that you may not want to see in a fen system.
Okay. Is a marsh part of a wetland ecosystem?
Yes, so a marsh is a wetland that's dominated by herbaceous vegetation. So you have swamps and marshes. Swamps are dominated by woody vegetation, things like trees and shrubs, and then marsh is dominated by the non-woody plants, all the herbaceous stuff like cattails and flowering plants, smaller flowering plants.
Why don't wetlands experience eutrophication like what happens in the Gulf?
So wetlands do experience eutrophication, but I think what they might be getting at is harmful algal blooms versus non-harmful algal blooms. So in a wetland ecosystem, a lot of wetlands will have fairly shallow water. So you may be looking at no more than 6 feet, maybe deep at its deepest, but a lot of the wetland might be pretty shallow where you have emergent or submerged aquatic vegetation. In those areas, because the water level is kind of low, you get a lot of interaction between the water and the soil in the wetland. Because you have that interaction, the nitrate can get into the soil and you can have microorganisms converting that from nitrate to nitrogen gas. So that helps to get rid of some. But then also you have specific types of algae that you find in wetlands that just don't typically tend to be those harmful algal bloom species. And why exactly they're not, I couldn't really answer that.
And the only thing I would add to that answer, and okay, you're much better equipped to answer that than I am, but I would just add that like hypoxic conditions, which is the challenge in the Gulf of Mexico, are the prevailing conditions in wetland environments. Wetlands, are often rather hypoxic. They, fish don't necessarily survive there in many cases. They're, for all the reasons Kay just listed and others, they're rather rugged ecosystems, and that's just their natural conditions. So I think the negative impacts of eutrophication are what we see in larger aquatic environments, and in wetlands it's kind of just like a normal condition to be rather eutrophication, of course, just meaning rich with nutrients, and that's just sort of a natural disposition for wetlands to be in. One reason they're very productive.
Kind of on those high nutrients in there, are coontail and duckweed indicative of high nitrogen amounts?
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I don't necessarily think so. Like Kay mentioned, those kind of plants. Coontail is a rooted, submerged aquatic plant, and then duckweed is actually a non-rooted aquatic plant, which is really cool. That floats on the surface of wetlands. They're going to be responding to nutrient conditions in the wetlands for sure, but they would of course be responding to more than just nitrates. And they'll also respond to other factors like Kay mentioned earlier, turbidity and water depth and sediment conditions that all will influence the growth conditions for a coontail or any one of many species of submerged or free-floating aquatic plants found in Iowa wetlands.
Next one is ag runoff endangering wetlands in Iowa.
It depends on how you look at it. So ag runoff can potentially impact sensitive wetland ecosystems that maybe aren't wetlands that can really tolerate or would naturally have high levels of nutrients. But there are systems that can tolerate those high levels of nutrients. And we're utilizing wetlands like crepe wetlands and multipurpose oxbows specifically to put high nutrient water into it to help reduce the nutrient load that ends up leaving those wetlands and getting into our other surface bodies water.
Okay, great. This one you forwarded to me, Adam. Are there specific soils associated with wetlands?
Sorry, Kay, I actually just accidentally muted you when I tried to unmute myself. Kay might be able to answer, but yes, there definitely are. That was those original slides that we shared with hydric soils. And if you were wondering about the specific names, I'm not particularly up on some of those name classes, but I know Okoboji is a really common one. I'll hear farmers often say, oh, those are Okoboji soils over there. And that often in sort of the parlance of north central Iowa, at least, means that's a poorly drained soil. And I think there's other classes, but I can't name them off the top of my head. But there are certainly conditions in the soil that are consistently mapped as allowing for wetland conditions to prevail. And that was those first couple of slides that we introduced.
Here's one. And are there cost analysis of constructing large nutrient wetlands versus buying out and restoring farmed or otherwise defunct wetlands?
I am not aware of any that specifically look at the cost comparison between those two types of wetland systems.
I think the only, maybe I can add here, not specifically that I know of, but one of the things that some of those wetlands that we might restore, if we aren't getting drainage water or nitrate laden water into them, they may be reducing, they may not be doing as much for nitrate reduction beyond the land area that they're, taking out of agricultural production. And that's kind of, Kay talked about the multi-purpose oxbow. There are many reasons we'd want to restore oxbows for habitat, but to get the greatest water quality benefit, we want to get that tile drainage water in there to get the nitrate reduction. Again, there are lots of other reasons why we want all types of wetlands, but for nitrate reduction, we have to make sure the nitrate gets into these systems. Just to confirm, I'm assuming this one is a yes. Will we be getting notice for the upcoming 12 videos?
Yes.
Okay, great. How about, I'm surprised if the postdoc was on, that I work with might have asked this too, but are ditches considered wetlands, albeit small ones?
So I would say yes. I'm looking at UK and trying to gauge your reaction. I'm inclined to call everything a wetland. That's just like a wildlife biologist thing. We just kind of like go through the world just asserting everything is a wetland because it's places where water pools for a period of time, hydrophytic plants live there, and wetland associated organisms are adapted to them. And so as oftentimes many ditches, particularly ditches that have had a lot of sediment input and sort of raised their profile, have functions comparable to wetland ecosystems. And so in some places that could be kind of, it'll make some people cringe, I think, but yeah, they function like a wetland in some places.
Yeah, I agree. In some instances, I think ditches can be considered to have wetland kind of ecosystems in them. So if you're looking at a ditch that clearly has wetland vegetation that maybe has water kind of standing in it or pooled in it, I'd say that's probably functioning similarly to a wetland ecosystem.
Yeah, and the biggest difference would be like hydrologic residence time, that concept that Kay introduced. Many ditches are designed to expedite, like minimize hydrologic residence time, whereas wetlands are the opposite. They generally maximize hydrologic residence time. So that would be an important distinction, but we do find places where ditches function in that way in modified landscapes.
What category of wetlands are sedge meadows in the type that you mentioned?
So sedge meadows are more palustrine type wetlands. They're kind of comparable to prairie pothole type wetlands, but not necessarily in the prairie pothole region. You can find them throughout the state.
This is an interesting one because we often talk about Iowa being one of the most hydrologically altered states. Is Iowa one of America's most biologically altered states?
Yeah, I think so, because of those hydrologic modifications and the extensive land use changes. We kind of, I don't know that there is a really precise accounting of like who wins that trophy, but Iowa's got to be pretty high on the list in terms of modifications, in terms of species that have been lost, or really their overall extent of their range that it's been reduced. So of course, all of these modifications to wetlands and then of course prairie environments have created pretty substantial changes in Iowa's landscape in the way that it would have looked in, say, the 1700s.
I know if you're looking specifically at wetland ecosystems, Iowa has lost somewhere around about 89% of wetlands since European settlement, which is pretty high compared to wetland loss in other states.
Do wetlands reduce phosphorus transport to rivers and streams, or rivers and lakes?
So potentially, it depends on the water that's coming into the wetland. If the water coming in has phosphorus that's attached to sediment particles, those sediment particles can settle out, and then that phosphorus kind of gets trapped in the wetland sediment. In some cases, you may also have dissolved reactive phosphorus within the water column. And in that instance, things like algae and plants within the system can help to take up that dissolved phosphorus.
I think we had a Iowa Learning Farms webinar from a gentleman from Ontario. Adam, you helped us get him, didn't you?
Yep.
And he talked about kind of some of their work on phosphorus, and they found that it can also, or a little bit may depend on what the historic phosphorus levels are in that wetland that's being restored. That if they had high soil test P in those wetlands, they could see it be a little bit of a source of phosphorus in some of those cases. So, I think those are really the last of the questions specifically associated with wetlands there, and got a lot of positive comments in there, and wanted people looking forward to the videos for sure. So,
so we're going to be sending out an email with a link to a survey, probably sometime tomorrow. That's going to have you can put in your information if you want to be contacted about the 12 wetland videos, and then also some other questions about this talk.
That sounds great.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I just saw a question go past. Where will the wetland videos live? So those are probably going to be put up on YouTube through ISU Extension.
And probably on the ISU Extension Natural Resources, probably links on your Natural Resources page, right, Adam?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right.